now it turns out the African Union have decided it's high time that those evil colonial nations that enslaved their ancestors and wrecked their wonderful kingdoms need to pay reparations. That's right, the African Union has come and turned around and said Britain hasn't done enough to absolve itself of its moral responsibility for the dreadful things we once did in Africa. I used to live in Africa, right? I've lived in a lot of parts of Africa, been around Africa a lot. And let me explain something to the African Union. You don't need reparations, you just need countries that aren't riddled with corruption. You need leaders that don't pocket all of the foreign aid we give you to buy private jets. Oh, don't you worry about getting reparations from us. The amount of money we've given you for the past 50 years since you're independent more than actually outspends anything that you think you deserve. What's more, we abolished slavery. That's right, we did that. 40% of our budget was spent on that. 1,500 lives at sea. We were the first people and we stood against the whole world in trying to end that evil trade. In fact, we didn't pay off the debts for having ended that evil trade until 2015. So that means I have already paid to end slavery. Thank you very much. So don't you come after me and tell me that I should be paying more, because I've lived in Africa and I'll tell you something. You don't function very well, and that's not our fault. We left your countries 50 years ago. It's your problem if you can't seem to organise a government and run your own systems. You can't keep blaming us. Do you get me? Let's speak now to the brilliant Connor Tomlinson, writer at Courage Media, who I'm sure is probably going to vent even more than I have just done on this subject. So should we all be tripping over ourselves, self-flagellating, paying reparations? Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, who's from Djibouti. Oh, that's a very high-functioning country. I should have forgotten. That's like Singapore, isn't it, Djibouti? You've done really well at bringing that place kicking and screaming into the 21st century. He seems to think that it's all our fault still.
Yeah, well, I might as well pack up and go home, Alex. You basically summarised all of my views. By the way, Yusuf was endorsed by the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. Given the Islamic slave trade, I think the total Arab slave trade number was about 24 million Africans sold into slavery. And it's still going on today, castrating Africans and selling them in open-air slave markets in Libya. I think probably the Islamic Empire bears a lot more responsibility than the British Empire for the problems in Africa. By the way, Djibouti is on China's Belt and Road scheme, which itself is an imperial conquest project, buying up places in Africa, exporting Chinese labour out there so that the Africans themselves don't get any work while doing so, indebting the country, and its corrupt dictators pocket all the proceeds while the Chinese own all the infrastructure in their country, fostering dependence in African countries. So, yet again, not going to take advice from this guy on imperialism. But, of course, Alex, it doesn't stop the grift from continuing based on historical racial grievances. The Caribbean already tried this, arguing for £18 trillion, an absolutely absurd number, in slavery reparations quite some time ago. The same nations, by the way, again, like Barbados, who went from the Commonwealth, gained independence and immediately started sidling up to the Chinese. But I find this laughable because the idea that Britain and its empire didn't bring lots of benefits to Africa, while also buying the Africans that their fellow brothers and sisters were already selling into bondage. So yes, evil historical crime, but the idea that we didn't bring lots of benefits like, I don't know, written language and the wheel to parts of Africa where they weren't invented yet is absolutely laughable. And I think a bit more gratitude rather than demanding handouts is warranted here.
I tell you what's a really interesting thing, as somebody who has lived and worked for protracted periods of time in East Africa and West Africa, is most Africans, not most, but there's a significant chunk of them who kind of wish we'd never gone. There's a lot of Africans, and I met people like that in Antigua as well, who were like, do you know what, we like the British did us a lot of good. It's our African leaders that are the problem. And yet the UK media laps up this stuff. They seem to love it every time, you know, a former colony has a pop at us for, here we go, structural and systemic injustice. I mean, that's just the normal sort of word soup you get out of these people, isn't it? But what I think we need to be talking about instead, and I've said this for a long time, you were talking about the predatory relationship, the parasitic relationship almost of China in Africa, and increasingly Russia. The Wagner mercenaries, now renamed the Africa Corps, are doing much the same in terms of seizing minerals, overthrowing regimes and offering security services in return for getting their hands on various resources. What we need to be doing as Brexit Britain is trading with these people properly and putting foreign direct investment in. Because we buy all of our tea from Kenya, and yet what happens is the sweepings from the Mombasa tea market market, go over to Poland, where they're then put in tea bags and then shipped to the UK. If we had a direct relationship and built that tea factory in Kenya, they'd have a load of grey-collar jobs.
Yeah, we've also got longer-standing historical ties, as you mentioned. Like, despite the corrupt leaders wanting to take kickbacks from the communist Chinese, Nigel Biggar, in his book Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, where he actually contends with the moral cases against the British Empire in a pretty fair and even-handed manner, he cites a lot of people living in modern-day Zimbabwe, previously Rhodesia, that said, we actually wish that the Brits were still around and it was Rhodesia again, because as soon as you guys left, we collapsed into hyperinflation, famine, and became a failed state and contingent on either foreign investment or handouts from places like the United Nations. Nigel Biggar also, in his book and in his excellent piece in The Telegraph refuting this racial grievance grift today, cites a bunch of stats about the actual cost of abolishing the slave trade, by the way, and he cites a historian called David Eltis that reckons that it cost British taxpayers £250,000 per year, so that is about 10% of the foreign aid budget in today's spending for half a century. And in absolute terms, this is a direct quote, the British spent almost as much attempting to suppress the slave trade in the 47 years 1816 to 1862, as they received in profits over the same length of time leading up to 1807. So we more than paid our costs. We only recently apparently paid it off, but remember, debt has eclipsed GDP at this point, so technically we paid it off with debt, so we're still kind of paying into the same pot that paid off slavery reparations, and we have more than paid our moral debt. And what I think, Alex, is actually most beneficial for Africa, and you all know this because you spent quite a lot of time there, but I only know this listening to wonderful videos on the internet by Africans explaining their own culture, is that yes, lots of Africans will blame the corrupt leadership in their countries, but other Africans will say it's a problem culturally in Africa that has not been rectified and has actually been chased out when the British left, because they don't have concepts like planning for the future or even words for maintaining things before they break in certain African cultures and languages. And so by giving them lots of money, including reparations, by flagellating ourselves with this historical racial guilt, we actually absolve them of the necessary duty that they have to look inwards at their own culture, to examine the reasons why they haven't developed the sort of civilization the people that preach things like Black Panther say that they're capable of, and instead repair those things so that they might get up to the standards of a first world country.
There you go, Connor. I couldn't agree any more with what you have just said. The brilliant Connor Tomlinson, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I love Africa, and I've got a great many African friends, and I know Africans who are extremely, exceptionally intelligent, industrious, with integrity, with great vision for the future. I think there are some brilliant presidents out there in Africa. I think the concept of Umaganda in Rwanda is one we should nick. They go about once a month, last Saturday of every month. Everybody but everybody has to roll up their sleeves and clean graffiti, mow the grass verges, pick up litter, get trolleys out the ravine. Doesn't even matter if you're there on holiday. You got to do it. I think that's a great idea of a communal work ethic. But I'm a realist about Africa. I've lived there. I know how it functions, or dysfunctions, more to the point, and it isn't racist to say so.